Great. Welcome to this evening's lecture for the By4 Collective, looking at issues of photography and democracy. Today we have two speakers, Anne Strachan-Cross and Matthew Fox-Amato. Anne Strachan-Cross is a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Bowdoin College Museum of Art in Brunswick, a specialist in 19th century photography and particularly interested in illustrated newspapers. Her current book project is titled Mediating Atrocity, Photography, Violence and the Civil War Press. It examines photographs of atrocity and wood engravings in Harper's Weekly. She's previously a fellow of the American Council of Learned Societies, the Luce Foundation, the American Antiquarian Society, the Boston Athenaeum, and the Massachusetts, I was doing so well, the Massachusetts Historical Society. Thank you, Anne. Matthew Fox-Amato is Associate Professor of History at the University of Idaho, previously a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Washington University in St. Louis. He's the author of Exposing Slavery, Photography, Human Bondage, and the Birth of Modern Visual Politics in America, published by OUP, which was a runner-up and finalist for multiple prestigious book awards. He studied at Harvard and USC, and his current book project is about presidents and photography. The title of their lecture is To Show or Not to Show, Ethics, Censorship, and the Case of the Scourged Back. Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Matthew. Over to you.
Thank you, Tom. And we want to begin by thanking the members of the By4 Photography and Democracy Collective, Tom Albason, Colleen O'Reilly, and Helen Trumpteller, for the invitation to present today and the opportunity to share our research. Before we begin, we also want to acknowledge that the images we will be discussing today are ones that depict the trauma of enslavement and anti-Black violence. We are mindful of the impact that these images may carry for viewers, especially those whose identities and lived experiences intersect with the histories presented. The ethics of circulating and displaying such images will be at the forefront of our discussion today. And I will go ahead and share my screen. In April of 1863, the Baton-Rouge-based photographers William McPherson and A.J. Oliver produced a series of images of a formerly enslaved man known as Peter or Gordon, in which the subject bore his scarred back to the camera, testimony to the violence of his enslaved past. One version in particular came to be known by the title The Scourged Back. Though little remains known about this figure, including his full name, textual evidence suggests that he was once enslaved on the cotton plantation of Captain John Lyons on the Atchafalaya River near Washington, Louisiana. Sometime in early 1863, Peter or Gordon self-emancipated and made his way to the Union Army encampment near Baton Rouge, where he enlisted as a soldier in the Louisiana Native Guards. It was then during the medical inspection required for enlistment that the scars on the man's back were discovered. Union Army officers stationed in Baton Rouge likely saw the potential for the sight of the man's injured body to galvanize public support for the Union and for emancipation, and arranged to have photographs taken of Peter or Gordon's scarred body. Shortly after the production of his photographs, the images of Peter or Gordon came to be circulated, copied, and collected throughout the United States and England, serving both as illustrations of the horrors of enslavement and justification for the war effort and the enlistment of Black soldiers. Later in this talk, Matt will describe how in the 19th century, there was a widespread belief that images held the power to affect social change, particularly within the abolitionist movement. However, more recent scholars and curators have questioned the effectiveness and appropriateness of viewing images of trauma. The question becomes whether it would be better in some cases to withhold Peter or Gordon's image from view. Embedded within these debates are longstanding questions about the purpose or value of looking at photographs of violence. In the early 1970s, critics like Susan Sontag and John Berger began to question the efficacy of photographs in generating moral action. Writing in the wake of both the Holocaust and the Vietnam War, these authors wondered whether the shock of photographed atrocities wore off with repeated viewings, and whether our capacity for ethical responsiveness had been diminished by our being bombarded by sensationalist photography. For Sontag in particular, photographs could not create a moral position, they could only reinforce existing ones. In her 1977 publication on photography, Sontag wrote that a photograph that brings news of some unsuspected zone of misery cannot make a dent in public opinion unless there is an appropriate context of feeling and attitude. Decades later, Sontag would reconsider her earlier stance in regarding the pain of others. Writing in response to the images of the war in Afghanistan and Abu Ghraib prison, Sontag was no longer convinced that photographs of violence shrivel sympathy, yet cautioned readers that no we should be taken for granted when the subject is looking at other people's pain. Scholars of Holocaust photography have also questioned whether looking at images of atrocities, and particularly those created without the full consent of their subjects, could revivify the perpetrator's gaze. Susan Crane has argued that because historical contexts are never completely discrete, and that for survivors, atrocity may endure through bodily memory and psychic trauma, photographs of atrocity may not be seen in any way except as artifacts of violence. In her work, Crane has considered choosing not to look as a radical alternative, and whether knowledge and understanding could be shared in the absence of the atrocity image. Crane also argues that we owe it to the victims, as well as scholarship, to conduct essential research to determine as exactly as possible the provenance, attribution, and the use of each atrocity image before we publish, teach, or reprint them. The idea that the apprehension of photographs and videos of violence may hold different experiences for those whose subject positions intersect with those histories dismantles the popular notion that photography is a universal language. Relatedly, in more recent discourse surrounding the circulation of images of anti-Black violence in the news and on social media, the news value of an image is weighed against the potential for it to be traumatic or exploitative of its subjects and their families. In her seminal essay entitled "Can You Be Black and Look at This?", Elizabeth Alexander responded to the 1991 videotape beating of Rodney King by arguing that different groups possess different collective memories, and that for Black Americans, a collective historical memory of trauma and continued physical vulnerability is reinvoked by looking at contemporary images of anti-Black violence. Within this framework, scholars such as Ariella Azoulay and Christina Sharp have elected to digitally alter or redact images, such as the Agassi daguerreotypes, as you see here, as a method to resist the perpetuation of photographic violence and ongoing trauma. These debates and creative interventions are cited to inform our understanding of when to reproduce or withhold the image of Peter or Gordon.
Thanks, Anne. The questions of when and how to present the Scourged Back have taken on new layers of meaning and heightened urgency in the past year. In September, the Washington Post reported that a national park had taken down the photograph of the Scourged Back, an action in line with a Trump administration directive for the U.S. Interior Department, which oversees the National Park Service, to remove material that, quote, inappropriately disparages Americans past or living. Now, a subsequent CNN story reported that a spokesperson from the U.S. Interior Department denied the story, stating that, quote, sites were not asked to remove the photo. Whatever the case may be, it's clear that more broadly, the public presentation of slavery in the U.S. is now under heightened scrutiny and even censorship. In fact, a New York Times story from last week, How the National Park Service is Deleting American History, describes the recent removal of historical exhibits, plaques, films, and other materials across the nation's national parks. One of the most unsettling removals has taken place at Independence National Historical Park in Philadelphia, where an exhibit about slavery, including those enslaved by George Washington at the President's House in 1790s Philadelphia, was taken down. The current political climate and the debates Annie discussed sparked our desire to confront head-on the problems posed as one engages the Scourged Back. Does the photo perform a vital function in this moment by revealing the violence at the core of American slavery, particularly as the honest presentation of slavery at historical sites is under attack? Alternatively, by this moment, have we circulated and looked at this man's pain enough for his sake and the sake of many viewers? Or lastly, is there a middle ground between these two perspectives that eschews any hard and fast rules and instead focuses on the specific histories in which it is important to include the image, such as the history of how abolitionists used photography. We should be clear about our goals today. We don't want to use this talk to offer a judgment. Instead, we want to provide a framework, or at least a kind of series of contexts and questions for historians and curators to think through as they consider whether and how to show and publish the Scourged Back. We've organized this talk in 3 parts. First, we'll focus on the period before the image, with attention to abolitionist scenes of violence and abolitionist photography in the 1840s and 1850s. Second, we'll hone in on the production and initial circulation of the image during the Civil War. And third, we'll look at the afterlives of the image from 1865 to the present. So I want to begin by talking a little bit about abolitionist visual culture and then more specifically abolitionist photography. To my mind, I think it's important that we don't simply treat this image as a revelation in American culture when it began to circulate in the spring of 1863. For decades, abolitionists, including formerly enslaved activists, had stressed the violence of bondage in all manner of cultural forms. Especially since the 1830s, as abolitionism shifted from gradualism to immediatism, the notion that slavery should end immediately and that enslavers should be uncompensated, activists did so through oral culture, print culture, and visual culture. The emergence of new media aided this campaign, especially the accessibility of lithographs and the rise of steam-powered presses. As scholars such as Karen Haltonen and Margaret Abruzzo have shown, abolitionists use images to stress Southern barbarism. Slide, please, Annie. Drawing upon visual formulas that dated back to the late 18th century, engravers and illustrators offered up a world of cruel masters, violent overseers, and suffering enslaved people, typically inhabiting plantations and domestic slave markets. One such vision, seen here, was the masthead of The Liberator, a widely circulated scene that included, on the left, the heartbreaking sale of a child at the auction block in the foreground, as well as its smaller, but hopefully you can see it on the far left, an image of an enslaved person being whipped. Political activist Angela Grimke felt these images altered the most basic perceptions of bondage from afar. Quote, until the pictures of the slave's suffering were drawn and held up to the public gaze, no Northerner had any idea of the cruelty of the system. Now, Grimke undoubtedly exaggerated the power of images, perpetuating a disposition that privileged sight as the sensory vehicle for best sympathizing with distant pain. When photography arrived in 1839, it proved an ineffective tool to extend many of the mass persuasion strategies cultivated in the 1830s. Most notably, the medium couldn't easily show the scenes of violence that had come to constitute slavery in the radical imaginary. An engraver or illustrator could easily imagine a barbarous slaveholder with a whip in the air. A photographer, on the other hand, needed to be present. Yet bulky tripods and long exposure times made that nearly impossible in the 1840s and 1850s. As I've detailed in Exposing Slavery, pre-war abolitionist photography was primarily composed of images of the movement, not the South. Portraits of black and white activists, images of rebels who sought to aid fugitive enslaved people, photos of freedom seekers who passed along the Underground Railroad. Next slide, please. That's not to say abolitionists did not experiment with ways of showing the brutality of enslavers. In 1845, they would do so in The Branded Hand, a daguerreotype of Jonathan Walker's poem. A white shipwright and tradesman, Walker had moved in the early 1840s from New England to Pensacola, Florida, where he soon agreed to help 7 enslaved people escape to the Bahamas by boat. Walker and the slaves set sail, but only 14 days into their journey, an American ship caught them and brought them back to land. A Florida judge subsequently sentenced Walker to an hour in the pillory, 15 days in jail, and a lifetime with a particular brand on his hand, SS, for slave stealer. 4 of the enslaved people were also imprisoned and beaten. For Walker, he was scarred but eventually free, and he returned to Boston, where prominent Boston physician and abolitionist Henry Ingersoll Bowditch suggested he daguerreotype his branded poem. Walker eagerly complied, placing his right hand on a table before the camera of Southworth and Hawes, two prominent photographers in Boston. Now, the daguerreotype process, which captured a mirror image of its subject matter, reversed Walker's hand, making it look like a left hand, as well as the SS that you can hopefully see in his poem. The daguerreotype reached the Boston community, where it was displayed in 1845 at an anti-slavery bazaar at Faneuil Hall. It was also republished as an engraving and circulated more broadly. Okay, so importantly for this section, in the mid-1840s, the branded hand revealed to abolitionists how they could use the daguerrean process for politics. They could draw upon the same photographic powers of mechanical representation that had astounded initial onlookers and photographic boosters. Samuel Morse, for instance, envisioned that this capacity for detail would benefit science. As he proclaimed, "We're soon to see if the minute has discoverable limits. The naturalist is to have a new kingdom to explore, as much beyond the microscope as the microscope is beyond the naked eye." The branded hand, the first instance of what I've called in my work damage photography in American history, applied Morse's vision to illuminate a body abused by Southern whites with unprecedented visual specificity. Yet it is striking, given the extensive publicity around the branded hand, how rarely abolitionists employed the tactic of damage photography over the next 2 decades. One might have expected immediatists to have capitalized on Walker's success by picturing the scarred bodies of many freedom seekers who came northward in the 1840s and 1850s. Between 1850 and 1858, for instance, the Vigilance Committee in Boston helped 407 fugitive enslaved people find homes and livelihoods. Surely some of those fugitives had scars. So the question here, in other words, is not about the impact of the Scourged Back, but instead, why did the Scourged Back not happen sooner? Many white and black abolitionists encountered, at least read about, ex-enslaved people with scars. The best known scars might have been those on Frederick Douglass's back. Douglass sometimes called upon his own lacerated body as important evidence of his former enslavement, as in the case of one lecture he gave in Ireland. As he put it, "I am the representative of 3 million of bleeding slaves. I have felt the lash myself. My back is scarred with it." Abolitionists could have taken a photograph of Douglass's back to display at their well-attended public functions. Indeed, the 1845 Faneuil Hall Bazaar that showed the branded hand also showed a daguerreotype of Douglass. Yet newspaper accounts mention kind of nothing unusual about Douglass's image, which I think suggests it was a regular portrait. Moreover, importantly, the notion of such a photograph might have crossed Douglass's mind, for he knew the branded hand well. He would later recall, as he put it, the sensation produced by the exhibition of the branded hand. It was one of the few atrocities of slavery that roused the justice and humanity of the North to a death struggle with slavery. Why then did abolitionists not photograph Douglass's back? Why did Douglass not do it himself, especially since he clearly recognized the capacity for such an image to intensify anti-slavery sentiment? Even though Douglass never commented on why he avoided photographing his own scars, one can infer that he opposed doing so from his publicized ideas about visual representation and his personal image practices. In Douglass's now famed 1849 review of Wilson Armistead's A Tribute to the Negro in the North Star, he argued that, quote, "it was next to impossible for white men to take likenesses of black men without most grossly exaggerating their distinctive features. And the reason is obvious. Artists, like other white persons, have adopted a theory respecting the distinctive features of black physiognomy, which led them to picture black subjects with high cheekbones, distended nostrils, depressed noses, thick lips, and retreating foreheads." Next slide, please. From the 1840s, Douglas offered a massive body of photographic evidence countering widespread racial perceptions. In fact, as John Stauffer, Celeste Marie Bernier, and Zoe Trott have shown in their fabulous book Picturing Frederick Douglass, he posed for his portrait photograph more than 160 times in his lifetime, more than any other 19th century American, including Abraham Lincoln and Walt Whitman. Douglass employed photography to stake claims to his personhood, his stance as a fugitive dissenter, and the potential for African Americans as prosperous and productive participants in Northern life. Next slide. Though Douglass made far more images than anyone else at the time, his search for visual dignity was hardly unique amongst formerly enslaved people. Take the case of Sojourner Truth. In her landmark biography, Nell Painter describes how Truth received a beating at the age of 9, which left her with scars, and how she injured her hand while she was enslaved. As Painter comments, Truth might have posed in settings and costumes reminiscent of her enslavement. Like Gordon with the mutilated back, she might have featured her right hand, or she might have posed as a worker, end quote. Instead, in her many cartes de visite of the 1860s, Truth drew upon symbols of middle-class femininity. She's often posed in a white shawl, seen here, rather than the markings of her former enslavement. And so what I'm trying to suggest here is, I think, a vital intellectual and cultural context for the Scourged Back. How other formerly enslaved people conceptualized and engaged photography. For a white abolitionist like Jonathan Walker, a photographed brand could spur sympathy and mobilize energy without downgrading or distracting from his own humanity. For formerly enslaved people like Douglass, Truth, and others, in contrast, they needed every tool they could find to project their humanity, to mobilize opposition to bondage, and subvert Northern racism. They jeopardized such aims if they pictured victimization, which could recall a former condition of violence and commodification, especially since they would lose control over the circulating image. We don't know what Peter or Gordon thought about his photographs in the process of taking them. An exploration of the 1840s and 1850s suggests that many other formerly enslaved people valued photography for many reasons, but not as a vehicle to highlight their victimization. We might consider this context more fully as we ponder the Scourged Back from Peter or Gordon's perspective.
Thank you, Matt. In this section, I want to turn to the more specific history of the production and circulation of the Scourged Back from approximately 1863 to 1865. Importantly, there are 3 different photographs that show Peter or Gordon displaying his scarred back, each of which saw wide circulation in the 19th century. Although all 3 photographs show Peter or Gordon in a similar pose, shirtless and with his back facing the camera, several key features distinguish the images from one another. In 2 of the images, what we'll call version A and version B, seen here on the left and in the middle, Peter Gordon has his left hand at his waist facing downward, and he also displays a prominent peak in his otherwise short hair. In version A, the frame of a simple slat-back chair is visible on the right side of the photographic frame. However, in version B, he has been switched to a stool. In version A, Peter or Gordon is also turned more to the left, with his left leg positioned nearly parallel to the horizontal axis of the photographic frame, and his head is tilted slightly downward. In version B, Peter or Gordon's head is somewhat raised, and he gazes more directly outward, allowing a few inches of facial hair to be visible beyond the curve of his shoulder. The third picture, hereafter version C on the right, closely resembles the first 2 in pose and dress. However, in version C, Peter or Gordon's left hand is twisted upward in a more stylized position that accentuates the muscles in his arm. Bracing his fingers against his back, in version C, Peter or Gordon twists his frame to reveal his profile more fully to the camera. In this image, his body appears taut and tense, evoking an air of resoluteness and gravity. His hair is also noticeably longer in version C, indicating that it was likely photographed later, perhaps even weeks after he sat for versions A and B. The minor changes to the composition between versions A, B, and C made the final image more arresting and effective, an aesthetic evaluation that is borne out by the photographic archive. Over the course of my own research, I've located 27 prints of the photographs of Peter and Gordon in public and private collections in the United States and United Kingdom, with all three variations represented within this broader group. This does not include photographs of Peter or Gordon that appear only in auction records or which otherwise exist in the shadow archive of private collections. Nearly all of Peter or Gordon's surviving images exist as carte de visite or albumen paper prints adhered to cardstock, although in some cases, the photographs have been floated off their mounts and pasted directly into albums created to memorialize the war. The large number of photographs of Peter or Gordon that survive today demonstrates the volume of their initial production and the breadth of their circulation. Of the 27 known prints, version C is the most widely reproduced, with back marks identifying the prints as products of photographic studios in Boston, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. The greater reproduction and circulation of version C suggests that audiences, if not simply photographic proprietors, found the later image to be the most compelling of the variations. It is also version C, which was famously reproduced as a wood engraving in Harper's Weekly illustrated newspaper, and we'll speak on that in a minute. Despite this vast photographic archive, relatively little is known about the production of Peter or Gordon's photographs, including whether he consented to having his picture taken. Notably, in all three images, Peter or Gordon's back is to the camera, foreclosing our ability to meet his gaze and access his interiority. All three photographs were likely produced by the Baton-Rouge-based studio of William McPherson and A.J. Oliver. In Baton Rouge, McPherson and Oliver produced studio portraits, as well as numerous views of the city, including photographs of troop encampments and African Americans who may or may not be contrabands, or fugitives from enslavement who sought protection behind Union Army lines. Later, after creating the photographs of Peter or Gordon's scarred back, McPherson and Oliver would travel to Port Hudson, where they photographed the Union siege of that city in June and July of 1863. Shortly after their production in April of 1863, the carte de visite of Peter or Gordon were circulated by Union Army members stationed in Louisiana to friends and family members back home in the North. For these Northern soldiers, Peter or Gordon's photograph served as an illustration of the conditions of enslavement and that of formerly enslaved people in the South, a visual supplement to that which they conveyed textually in letters to friends and family back home. At the same time, the images of Gordon's lacerated back, particularly those that circulated in progressive northern cities, provided additional visual evidence in support of arguments for the necessity to win the war and abolish enslavement. As Matt has argued in his publication Exposing Slavery, the core photographic debate over the character and future of African Americans took place in Union Army camps, as it was in this liminal space between bondage and freedom that Northern soldiers confronted the reality of slavery, as they directly encountered thousands of fugitive slaves, many of them bearing the scars of their inhumane treatment, like Peter or Gordon. Though anti-slavery images, magazines, and novels had made many Northerners familiar with the horrors of enslavement, it did little to diminish the effects of seeing slavery in person. In circulating Peter or Gordon's photograph through letters to friends and family back home, the soldiers enacted their own reckoning with enslavement. Today, we can trace the circulation of Peter or Gordon's photograph by the excerpting of soldier letters in local newspapers. Understanding the image's circulation also helps us gain a better understanding of the impact that the photograph had on Northern audiences. The first published reference that I have found of Peter or Gordon's photograph is in the May 1st, 1863 issue of the Haverhill Gazette from Haverhill, Massachusetts. In an excerpt of a letter sent from Baton Rouge by Samuel Knapp Towle, a surgeon for the 30th Mass Volunteers, to his parents back in Haverhill, Towle frames his sending of Peter or Gordon's photograph within the debate over Black men's military service and describes his own favorable impressions of African American troops. In his letter, Towle recounts several conversations he has had with others about the discipline and commitment of Black soldiers, to give his parents, quote, an idea of how actual contact with colored troops influences men most strongly opposed to their employment, end quote. Towle then goes on to note that he is enclosing the picture of the back of a former slave who came in here, showing the scars remaining from a whipping given him a long time ago. Comparing the power of the photographic image, to the text of a slave narrative, so comparing the photographic image to the text of slave narratives, Towle wrote that no story he had ever read of the beating of slaves was more incredible than this picture. It doesn't seem possible that one human being could bruise and mangle another so as to leave for life such marks, Towle wrote. But there is the picture drawn by the sun as incontrovertible proof that such enormities are. Similar letters appear in the archives of soldiers in the 52nd Mass and 116th New York Regiment, again excerpted by their local papers. For example, shortly after Peter Gordon's photographs were produced in early April 1863, a crude woodcut after version C appeared in the Buffalo Weekly Express, after a photograph sent by Colonel Edward Payson Chapin of the 116th New York Volunteers. Chapin reported that Peter Gordon's back was a mass of most frightful scars, and stated that he is something to fight for and is going to fight for his race. In the same letter, Chapin wrote that Baton Rouge was the greatest place to coin abolitionists in America, as white soldiers' encounters with slavery could fuel their anti-slavery sentiment. Directly addressing unresolved public opinion as to whether Black men could adequately fight or not, Chapin wrote, "If ever there was a righteous cause, it is that of the Black race against their masters." Significantly, what is lacking from this archive is an understanding of how Peter Gordon himself felt about the circulation of his image by white historical actors.
In the North and in Britain, abolitionists quickly harnessed the image to prove why the Emancipation Proclamation had not gone far enough. While they initially cheered the proclamation, abolitionists criticizing it for leaving almost 800,000 enslaved people untouched, including all those bondspeople in the border states of Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland. In June of 1863, the New England Anti-Slavery Convention in Boston passed a series of resolutions calling for slavery's immediate abolition in such portions of the country as were exempted. They demanded that there be no possibility provided for future slaveholding, concession, and compromise. At some point in the convention, William Lloyd Garrison stood before a crowd at Tremont Temple and applauded, as he put it, a representation of the frightful scars caused by whipping on the back of a Louisiana slave. Susan B. Anthony, too, used the image, which she held up alongside a photo of Sojourner Truth to raise money in support of abolition at a meeting of the Women's Loyal League. For the most part, the image seems to have been displayed as a small carte de visite, except in the case of British abolitionist George Thompson, who turned the Scourged Back into a massive placard and displayed it during wartime lectures in America in the winter of 1864. Increasingly, we see abolitionists making photography a vital component of their political truth apparatus to highlight the evils of slavery. Despite the significant scholarly attention paid to the image, I want to note here that while we don't know what Peter Gordon thought about the circulation of images, we currently also lack a sense of how Black Americans during and immediately after the Civil War responded to the image. What, for instance, did Frederick Douglass think of this photograph? Alongside the public display of the image at lectures, it became a private object through its commercial sale. If you look at the Liberator in the summer of 1863, the National Anti-Slavery Standard as well, you see them selling copies to subscribers. One copy for 15 cents, 7 copies for $1, a dozen for $1.50. Anne and I have both uncovered evidence of abolitionists basically keeping these images in their carte de visite albums. I'll turn it back to you, Anne.
Following the photograph's vast circulation as a carte de visite, the image was then famously reproduced as a wood engraving in Harper's Weekly. And it is this reproduction that is a source of a great deal of confusion surrounding Peter Gordon's identity and narrative. Captioned Gordon under medical inspection, in Harper's, the image of the man's scarred back is framed by 2 other slightly smaller illustrations, which purport to show his embodied transformation from an escaped bondsperson to a soldier. I'll provide the photographic sources as well. These other images are captioned Gordon as he entered our lines and Gordon in his uniform as a U.S. soldier, showing a Black man in tattered clothes and a Black man in a Union military uniform with his hands resting upon the barrel of a musket. The accompanying article reports that the 3 illustrations all depict an African-American man named Gordon, who escaped from his master in Mississippi and came into our lines at Baton Rouge in March last. Aggregated in the lower register of Harper's page, the triptych appears beneath the large sketch illustration of the Combahee River Raid, in which the 2nd South Carolina Volunteer Infantry, an African-American military regiment, liberated enslaved persons from South Carolina rice plantations, Taken as a whole, the dynamics of Harper's page layout are engineered to suggest the potentialities of Gordon's future military service and his meaningful participation in the Union Army's liberatory project. For an American public that remained unresolved about Black men's military service, the sight of Peter O'Gordon's scarred body juxtaposed with this image of Black heroism would have provided a reassuring nationalist vision of African Americans' enlistment in the Union Army. However, as scholars such as David Silkenat and Cassandra Jackson have noted, Harper's vision of Black men's participation in the Union is marred by the ways in which they collapse the identities of these three distinct men into one narrative, thereby dismissing the specificity of Gordon's individual lived experience. While many Northern newspapers reacted to Harper's triptych favorably, praising the illustration as a picture for the times, many Democratic and Confederate audiences denounced the publication of Peter O'Gordon's image. Just weeks after the publication of Harper's article, the newspaper's Confederate counterpart, the Southern Illustrated News, reprinted Harper's account as well as the wood engraving of the Scourged Back, but noted that a more palpable falsehood was never published in any Yankee paper. Notably, many of those who objected to the image's publication did not dispute the veracity of Peter O'Gordon's photograph, but objected to its use as a tool as political propaganda.
I want to turn now to our third and final section, which is looking briefly at the life of the image from 1865 to the present. And I think what has struck both of us really is when you look from the end of the war until the late 20th century, the image seems to have achieved limited public visibility. I sat with in the library the other day with the 10 volumes of Francis Miller's 1911 photographic history of the Civil War, and didn't see it. We've looked at John Hope Franklin's From Slavery to Freedom, and interestingly, the third edition, which was published in the 60s, 1967, included a few images from slavery and abolition. The slave ship Brooks that was used in the late 18th century, the frontispiece from Frederick Douglass's 1845 narrative, an image of Henry Box Brown, but did not include the Scourged Back. Next slide, please. Interestingly, there is one text that we found that did include it in the 60s, and that is James McPherson's 1965 book, The Negro's Civil War, which, as you can see in the top right corner there, took the engravings from Harper's and kind of reordered them. I think part of the point here is that the continuing life of the Scourged Back after 1865, in both its presences and its absences, beckons further research.
It's interesting to see that Peter O'Gordon's photograph seems to have dropped out of broad public visibility for many years, especially when we consider that today the image persists in a variety of forms. Today, Peter O'Gordon's image can be seen in civil rights murals, magazine illustrations, and contemporary artworks. In 2021, a feature-length film was even produced that dramatized Peter O'Gordon's self-emancipation, starring the actor Will Smith. The photographer Dario Calmese has also acknowledged using Gordon's image as the inspiration for his portrait of actress Viola Davis that appeared on the cover of the July-August issue of Vanity Fair, in which the actress appears with her exposed back facing the camera and her left wrist bent at her waist. Similarly, for artists such as Carrie Mae Weems, Arthur Jaffa, and Hank Willis Thomas, the appropriation of the Scourged Back photograph within their own creative practices illustrate not only the ongoing legacies of the historic trauma of enslavement, but also an effort to call out the framing of Peter O'Gordon within the white supremacist gaze and to reclaim his image for Black Americans. Arthur Jaffa, for example, has spoken of how he first encountered Peter O'Gordon's photograph as a teenager in Mississippi, and how for him the image is both ugly and beautiful. In an interview, Jaffa stated his belief that it's still an image of Black abjection, but that works against the grain in the way that Peter O'Gordon is carrying himself, like an aristocrat. And that the whole idea of a thing that's horrible or ugly can be beautiful is one of the conundrums of Black pain. When we are called to consider the utility or appropriateness of exhibiting representations of Peter O'Gordon's scarred body, it's important that we take into consideration the profound meaning that the image continues to have, including for Black contemporary artists. Ultimately, these diverse examples demonstrate the iconic nature of Gordon's photograph. Iconic photographs, as the scholars Robert Harriman and John Lewis Lacades have argued, are those which are widely understood and remembered and are strategically used to orient the individual within a context of collective identity, obligation, and power. Circulate across a range of media, appropriated by diverse actors, and folded into a rich intertext of public culture, icons are both highly specific objects of memory and abstract representations whose value is more symbolic than referential. By nature of their legibility, iconic photographs activate deep structures of knowledge and belief that guide social interaction and civic judgment, and allow for the formation of subjective identity while maintaining dominant social structures. According to Harriman and Lacades, icons are thus able to serve as aesthetic resources for the performative mediation of historic conflicts without definitive resolution. The abstracted form of Gordon's Scourged Back, whether instrumentalized by artists, the press, or museums, signifies both the progress achieved by African Americans and the enduring nature of anti-Black racism in the United States, as well as the role of photography in the simultaneous triumph and failure. And I briefly also want to note that today, Peter Gordon's image is also frequently reproduced within contemporary discussions about the ethics and political efficacy of reproducing images of violence. For example, in a 2023 New York Times article that questioned whether the release of photos of the victims of school shootings could lead to better gun control policies in the United States, one of the photographs of Peter or Gordon was employed as a historic example of images of violence that were able to enact or incite change. I'll kick it to you, Matt.
We're coming to our conclusion here. When Gordon or Peter sat for a series of images in the spring of 1863, he did so amidst a nation riven by conflict and ripe with uncertainty. Which side would win the war? Would slavery persist or not? While we don't know what Gordon or Peter thought about his photograph, an image that stressed his victimization, we do know that after he left the camera's gaze, he went to fight for the Union Army. In that way, beyond the frame, he set out to actively shape America's future. Today, we find ourselves in a new moment of conflict and uncertainty. Perhaps that's what brought some of you here today. Our talk has avoided prescriptions about the image, show it, don't show it, but instead sought to lay out a number of key questions and contexts. It has considered how we should avoid treating the image as simply a revelation to American culture in 1863. It has asked us to ask, how do we understand the image and process of image making from Gordon or Peter's perspective? It has suggested we account for its complicated history of production and circulation beyond the Harper's Weekly reproduction, including its uses by abolitionism, as we aim to grasp its political impact. It has explored the long life of the image, which has been taken up and appropriated by contemporary artists. At its best, the Scourged Back was used during the Civil War to push the United States towards a future that was more free, more just. Whether one uses Gordon or Peter's image or not, perhaps continuing that work is what we ultimately owe him. Thank you.
Annie, Matt, thank you very much for a timely and fascinating lecture, which was also reflexive and meticulous. A really interesting and constructive way to start our new season. May I offer a round of applause from the audience? They're doing it online. I think we'll stop the recording there and then open up for a Q&A.